Welcome to Tipperary district. Previous film in 6 parts explored aspects of the history and heritage of Tipperary town. This documentary does the same with respect to the countryside around that town. Again, taking 6 chapters to discuss a Bronze Age tomb, an early Christian church, a Norman motte and bailey, an Augustinian Priory, a 15th century tower house, and an early 19th century Gothic revival castle. As a great poet wrote, "In succession houses rise and fall, crumble, are extended, are removed, destroyed, restored, or in their place is an open field or a factory or a bypass. Old stone to new building, old timber to new fires, old fires to ashes, and ashes to the earth." With a time span of 2,000 years and more, we are reminded that successive occupiers of the space we call home imprinted something of their perceptions and ambitions on the landscape. Places where they buried their dead, where they prayed, where they sought to hold what they won by the sword, where they established an institutional relationship with God, where they lived always ready to repulse attackers, and finally where a family in building a castle declared their importance to the world. All now ruin and decay. Which is the nature of nature. But those crumbling structures, the stories they generate as well as the secrets they hide, all serve to remind us that we also are just players in an ongoing narrative. Here in the townland of Ballynadruckley, on the road from Tipperary town and just outside Latin Village, a swelling of the earth demands notice and invites speculation. What in its origin was all too real, a place of burial, has long since become a trigger for myth and legend, a place where folk of the other world live and which we disturb at our peril. A fairy fort indeed. Except that our more usual designation as fairy fort relates to ring forts, the most common archaeological monuments in Ireland, which are especially widespread in this region, with as many as 45,000 examples across the island. In this photograph, a few miles from Cashel, 3 ring forts are immediately visible. These ring forts, or raths, are the fairy forts of common perception, and ring forts were places of work and home, not places marking the burial of the dead. Always worth remembering, Darby O'Gill was a Tipperary man. The point is that this monument just outside Latin Village is not a ring fort, which are much younger than the mound we see here at Ballynadruckley. While most ring forts date from the early Christian period, this tumulus or burial mound is Bronze Age, a period of some 2,000 years that lasted up to 500 years or so before the age of Christ. This mound is in fact one of the oldest structures in the region. Longstone in Cullen is perhaps a related site. Probably the first written notice we have of this monument is from August 1840, when in connection with the mapping work being done by the Ordnance Survey, antiquarian scholar John O'Donovan visited and noted what was old and man-made and of interest on the landscape. In Latin Village, apart from the old churchyard and a holy well, there was not a lot to engage his interest. He did, however, note what he termed a hillock planted with fir trees, which he said was called Knock-on Bui, which tells us nothing other than perhaps it was a place covered with yellow firs. That this mound is a burial marker and not a place where people lived adds to its otherworldly atmosphere. A question we can ask, but without answer, is why a burial on this exact spot? We have to imagine a landscape with all the man-made features removed. Forests and tracks in place of settlements and roads, from a time before history. Before words transmit the past, we rely on what is found in the ground for our shards of information. This particular site has not been excavated, But it is reasonable to note the effort that had to go into its construction, and that consequently someone of importance was buried there. Such is the poverty of our knowledge that on the basis of the bits of pottery that survive, rather pedantically this culture has been labelled Beaker. Sutton Hoo, the famous Anglo-Saxon burial chamber in Suffolk, where treasures were found, well, this is not. As a poet asked, in a different context, what men or gods are these? Well, we should leave aside images of kingly warriors being buried in state, surrounded by the comforting presence of household goods. It is more likely that bones, probably burned bones rather than bodies, are buried here, perhaps placed in a stone-built passage, long since covered over with earth and never disturbed. When old age shall this generation waste, thou shalt remain, in midst of other woe than ours. If we choose, a place like this, in the words of another poet, the point of intersection of the timeless with time, it can remind us of our own brief passage across Tipperary's landscape, though leaving a far more substantial footprint. This is the townland of Turin in the parish of Killardry, and with the eastern slope of the Galties to the south. This holy site is located where the ramparts of mountain and hill open into the plain that stretches towards Cashel. Whereas hill and hollow remain, the trees that made this place a sanctuary are long gone. Not that those who valued this place only trusted God. There is some evidence the site was enfolded within an earthen enclosure. This hidden site was not hidden enough, and in Coga Gael, August Golliff, or the War of the Irish with the Foreigner, there is reference to an attack by the Vikings around 820. Unsurprisingly, in the early Christian church, men in search of God and hoping to find him in such a landscape gravitated towards places like this, conveniently near flowing water. Not far away is the church site associated with St. Berhart, and at the western end of Ahallow Valley we find Clonbeg, where there is a well associated with St. Sedna. This site at Turin was called Clún Ord Mo Bicog in the annals. This might be translated as the bit of decent land surrounded by worse, associated with St. Begon or Beacon. For some reason, apparently in Munster, the B of this name became a P, so we have Pecon, poetically remembered as Beacon, who loved vigils. His abode was in Clún Ord. He, however, was not the founder of this church. That was Abban, a saint associated with Wexford, but a man who moved about founding churches, and in this instance he left Beacon or Pecon in charge. The Annals of Innisfallen, a source associated with Emily, record the death of Pecon of Clún Ord in 689. It was all so very long ago, and places like this leave little on the written record, and frequently such records as exist are generations apart from what is being described. All we have is what is written on the landscape and what generations choose to remember and transmit. First reference we have to this site in modern times is from 1840, when information about antiquities was gathered during the Ordnance Survey work to map Ireland. The man who visited and recorded details that September 1840 was Patrick O'Keeffe, one of that band of Gaelic scholars associated with the great John O'Donovan, who in a way invented Ireland. Amusingly, O'Donovan, who was O'Keeffe's boss, thought him a slacker. "It is really too bad," O'Donovan wrote, "that a young man in the flower of youth and health should shrink from the business for which he is paid." And of course it was not always easy, travelling into remote places and braving the suspicions of locals, not least in Tipperary during those pre-famine years when violence was endemic. O'Keeffe was not alone. With him was an artist, George Dunoyer, Irish but of Huguenot descent, who worked for several government agencies, including in this instance the Ordnance Survey. Here we see him looking like every Victorian gentleman who ever drew breath. While O'Keeffe measured, Dunoyer sketched. The site today is a managed ruin with several elements: a small oratory, some 35 feet by 25, several cross shafts and the obligatory well. The evidence of absence suggests that this location was a religious site up to the 12th century. This decorated Romanesque window suggests 12th century. This place functioned across several centuries. We don't know exactly how. Thereafter the building fell into ruin, but continued to be a focus of popular religion, which was a mixture of paganism and Catholicism. Very early in the 20th century, well-known archaeologist Robert McAllister, just after his return from several years' excavation in the Holy Land, took note of the broken and scattered slabs at Turin. During the 60 or so years between this interest in the site and O'Keeffe's visit, there was at least one day in the year when people from surrounding parishes flocked to the site, and that was the 1st of August, the Pattern Day, meaning the patron's or saint's day, though in keeping with nothing being straightforward with respect to matters so long ago, Pecaun's actual feast day seems to have been the 26th of May. O'Keeffe was told that devotions were also performed at this site on Good Friday. In 1875, the first day of August was a Sunday, which meant that people were free on that fine summer's day to flock to the site. A description of the day survives. All in their Sunday best, the younger people with eyes for each other, the older people intent on their devotions, and all marvelling at the blind trout at swim in the holy well. On the evidence of this visitor in 1875, there was a carnival atmosphere, and rather like at a race meeting, the occasion attracted hawkers and three-card trick merchants, and all manner of chances. The contemporary account references musicians present, fiddlers and pipers, and that towards evening, dancing became general. No wonder the institutional church was not keen on such devotions. The stones that constitute such a place, not least when inscribed, cannot be left where they fell. They would be, and indeed were, stolen. Consequently, a site like this is tidied up, and here at Turin Pecaun, everything is owed to the excavation carried out in 1944 by Michael Dignan, a decade after the site passed to the care of the state. One of those working with Dignan was John Hunt, now remembered because of the museum in Limerick. If elsewhere mute stones speak, well, here they barely whisper. The incised and minimally decorated slabs, or realistically their fragments, some with personal names and simple crosses, have puzzled scholars. One is reminded of T.S. Eliot's line about old stones that cannot be deciphered. The most obvious purpose of such inscribed stones is grave markers, but convention always demands more than just a name in such usage. Where are the invocations, the prayers, the dedications? More likely then, these names are incised in stone as memorials to lives past in God's service, and thus to be remembered in prayer. This stone, for example, communicating a little more than companion fragments, was found during the excavation in that summer of 1944, and during the last months of that year, the east wall of the church was rebuilt using many of the inscribed stones. Unusually, there are two personal names and two crosses, and it has been suggested that the name at the top, in a different script to the bottom name, was of higher status. The top name translates as Cummion, and the bottom and more unusual name as Leitkin. Perhaps this was some kind of memorial. According to the Annals of Inishfallen, remember a source associated with Emily, in 661, two high-status individuals with those names died. Names remembered on other stones are Solbar, Vidlair, Dungus and Flan. Apart from the ruins of the little church, a visitor is drawn to the concentration of stones protected by a cattle grid, which was installed by archaeologist Conleth Manning in 1987. The main feature is the cross shaft and its stone platform. The incised lettering is very worn and is probably Irish rather than Latin. Perhaps it was this cross that the annalist recorded, writing about the saint, that he had a stone cross erected outside, apart, and there at dawn in all weathers he did the cross vigil while reciting the Psalter. Recitation, there was both penance and prayer as the saint stood, arms extended, worshipping God in what was then a natural haven. In recent years, the site has been excavated by a team from UCC, led by Tomás O'Carrigoin. That human remains were found occasions no surprise, as such sites as burial places always had a special resonance, not to mention as burial places for unbaptized infants. Also in this location are stones with hollows that appear more worn than made. As one story has it, the hollows worn from pilgrims' knees. At the remains of a circular structure known as St. Pacon's Cell, there's another Boulogne stone, meaning a hollowed stone. Perhaps the hollow was a receptacle for holy water. There's an association between these stones and butter. Well, we are in Tipperary. And as narrated in the school's folklore collection, the saint one day encountered a woman lacking in generosity who refused to share her butter, and so it was turned to stone. Sites like these have to have a holy well, and St. Pacon's Well, thankfully, is devoid of the Disney-esque circular wall and sloped roof. Instead, there are steps to the water, which of course has curative properties. In 1841, it was described as surrounded by a circular ring of stonework, and almost a century later, this site was described as under a hawthorn tree and surrounded by a wooden paling. Unlike neighbouring sites, this well at Turin, when visited at the beginning of the 20th century, appeared to have no votive offerings, the practice of hanging cloth on adjacent bushes or of leaving coins or holy medals. A short distance from the well is a structure indicated as a clochon or an ancient beehive-shaped habitation. Much more likely it's a Boulogne stone, in this instance a receptacle for holy water. We should be thankful that any stones survive at Turin, and with imagination we can capture something of the early settlement as holy men from so long ago sought to find God in the shadow of Slievenard. A date all Irish school children knew, and hopefully continue to know, is 1169, when the Normans arrived in Ireland, landing in Wexford. The story is well known. Dermot MacMurrough, having lost his Leinster kingdom, sought help from Henry II, who allowed knights not from Normandy but from Wales to try their luck in Ireland. Once in, there was no getting rid of them, and over the next decades they advanced on Dublin and across the island, their objective in this region being Limerick, which territory was under the control of the O'Briens. In order to ensure that none of his knights was tempted to go it alone in Ireland, King Henry II came to Ireland in 1171. There is a story that the O'Brien king submitted to Henry at the bridge in Golden, which Henry certainly would have crossed on his way to Cashel, which was in the hands of the church for the previous 70 years. Ostensibly, one of the reasons Henry was in Ireland was to reform the Irish church. A few years later, in 1174, the Irish had a temporary success when they defeated a Norman army at the Battle of Thurles. But the advance of the foreigner was inexorable. Henry made his son Lord of Ireland, and so John, not yet 20, visited for a few months in 1185. John has a familiarity because of his appearance in countless Robin Hood movies, and was every bit as unpleasant and inept as popularly depicted. In the Disney cartoon Robin Hood, John is given the form of a mangy lion. As Lord of Ireland, John could and did make substantial grants of land. The fact that all of this land was already owned and occupied did not matter. Once granted, it was up to the grantee to make good by force of arms. Castles were built at Ardfinnan, Lismore, and on the South Kilkenny border with Waterford at a place called, and I will spell it, Tibberaghy. This is perhaps where the confusion arose with respect to a castle in Tipperary. At that stage, there was no town, and the purported King John's Castle is a mistake. In terms of family history, what happened in this part of Ireland towards the close of the 12th century was that the O'Briens, who had pushed the McCarthys south, were overwhelmed by the Burkes, who in turn eventually were displaced by the Butlers. The Cormac of Cormac's Chapel on the Rock of Cashel was a McCarthy, and that family had for centuries controlled Cashel and dominated the region. Then the O'Briens, with Brian Boru as their great figure, came out of the Clare-Tipperary border region and defeated the McCarthys, who unsurprisingly refused to recognise that new reality and continued to fight back. Of course, this is simplistic, which never prevents something being accurate. Ireland, politically divided into various kingdoms, was invaded by a single unified empire that stretched from the Scottish border to the Pyrenees. On the other hand, Ireland being so fractured made it much more difficult to conquer. McCarthy's, O'Brien's, Burke's and then Butler's. Initially the Butlers exercised dominance in North Tipperary. It was not until 1328 that James Butler was granted control over the entire county, which as a recognisable territorial entity didn't exist until around 1250. One of the English magnates to whom John granted land in Ireland across parts of Tipperary and Limerick was William de Burgh, member of a well-connected Norman family. Echoes of William de Burgh remain in that the barony name for the region is Clon William. And of course, not a small thing, William was progenitor of the Burke family, however spelled. In a predictable career move, he married a daughter of Donald Moore O'Brien, sometime King of Munster and incidentally the founder of Holy Cross Abbey. Obtaining a grant of land was one thing, getting possession of the land and keeping it something else. Garrisons had to be put in place and maintained, and to this end fortifications were thrown up as quickly as possible, making use of high ground and enhancing its defensive capacity. Why was Kilfeacle picked as a primary site? Way back when the landscape hosted a scattered population, the only two settlements of any consequence in the region were Cashel and Emly. Consequently, the road between them mattered. Whether you approach Kilfeacle from Tipperary or Cashel, you go up a hill, and at the top of that hill, the Normans pitched their fort. There is a suggestion that use was made of an existing Bronze Age burial mound. The famous Annals of the Four Masters, in its entries for what it termed the Age of Christ 1192, declared that the English in their push west erected the castles of Kilfeacle and Knockgraffon. While we do not know the sequence, within a very short time, forts of this type, mottes with or without bailey, were thrown up at the two sites mentioned, as well as at Dunohil, Grenan, Garnacanty, Mount Bruce, Morgasty, Croagmore and Tipperary Hills. These last two sites have been destroyed. Testifying to their perceived importance, the mottes at Kilfeacle and Dunohil are each in a townland called Motte Quarter. Now, in popular Irish usage, there can be confusion between a motte, M-O-A-T, which is a defensive water feature, and a motte, M-O-T-T-E, which is a Norman fort. Incidentally, G.H. Orpen, the great historian of the Normans in Ireland, was educated at the Abbey Grammar School in Tipperary town, and therefore his early exposure to the evidence of the Normans on the landscape would have been these structures. Orpen described a typical motte as from 20 to 40 feet in height, with very steep sides and with a flat space on the summit from about 30 to 100 feet across. On this summit, giving a view of the surrounding countryside, a wooden defensive structure was rapidly erected. And sometimes beside this elevation and attached to it was a lower open space called a bailey, which once protected by a wooden palisade was used to hold the Normans' horses. Rather like a modern army finding somewhere safe to park their tanks. This drawing and this example from County Kildare give a very good idea of the configuration of what one recent historian has called the most enduring reminder of the military conquest of Ireland by the Anglo-Normans in the late 12th century. Kilfeacle Motte and Bailey is today degraded and ignored. This early Ordnance Survey map from around 1840 shows very clearly the motte, called a moat, and to the north of it, very close to the chapel, the associated and less elevated bailey. Not a surprise, but the building of the chapel was no help to the integrity of the bailey. At this time, before Orpen's work, such constructions as these hills were ascribed to the Danes, seen as part of the Viking onslaught on Ireland. These photographs date from over 70 years ago, and the bottom picture shows the motte and bailey from the northeast. The photograph of the motte, looking south, purports to show the very ruined defensive structure, stonework that was probably part of the more prominent defences constructed after the initial build. Just as was demonstrated by MacMurrough, other Irish lords were not above making temporary alliances with the grey foreigners, and so in 1193 we learn that the motte in Mount Bruce was constructed with the consent of the O'Briens in order to inconvenience the McCarthys, who however hit back 3 years later by attacking the garrison at Kilfeacle. 8 members of the Norman garrison were killed and 2 officers taken prisoner. This was no more than a temporary bother. Longer term, and certainly into the mid-13th century, Kilfeacle was an important administrative centre for the de Burgh landholding in this part of Ireland. The original wooden defensive structure was replaced by stone, and a small settlement developed, and in 1242 William de Burgh's son obtained a royal grant to hold an annual fair at his manor of Kilfeacle. However, the Burke connection with Kilfeacle ended with William's grandson Walter, who had the title Earl of Ulster and interests elsewhere, and in return for alternative land grants surrendered this region to the Crown. In 1281, the King Edward I granted, among other places, Kilfeacle to a friend of his at court who was actually from modern-day Switzerland, where he now lies in stately repose in Lausanne Cathedral. The limited evidence that we have suggests that Kilfeacle with its castle was the administrative centre of a large region known as Muskerry. This was part of the Diocese of Cashel, whereas Tipperary town and district were part of a different lordship and in any case were in the Diocese of Emly. There's a record from 1277 of the people of Kilfeacle being fined by the sheriff the huge sum of 100 shillings because they as a community were held responsible for the escape of a felon. Thanks to the destruction of public records during the Civil War, there is much that we shall never know about a place like Kilfeacle. However, the next time you drive past, reflect for a moment that on one side of the road is a monument in soil and grass to the early stage of the extinction of self-government in Ireland. On the other side of the road is the grave of Sean Tracy, whose life was lost in the fight for the restoration of that self-government. Having been granted large amounts of land along the river shore, the Norman knight William de Burgh, later of course Burke, established a fortified place and administrative centre at Kilfeacle. To consolidate his position, he married a daughter of Donal More O'Brien, King of Munster, and with some setbacks was able to accommodate himself to the whims of his royal master, King John. De Burgh, who was obviously a powerful personality, was a member of a minor Norman landholding family, one of whose properties was the manor of Burgh near Aylsham in Norfolk. One of his brothers became Earl of Kent and Justiciar of England. Another became Bishop of Ely. So a family of ambitious men. In an age of faith, with success in the present, it was all the more important to look beyond the future and into eternity, and to keep God on your side. To this end, around 1200, William de Burgh, in a fold of the shore, on that river's west bank, established a religious foundation. The site, some 4 acres, was a short distance south of the primary crossing of that river, a place where an island in the river facilitated crossing, and in time gave its name to the ford, later anglicised as Golden. There is some evidence that across the river from the priory, now hidden by trees, was another motte, a fort quickly constructed, very likely to protect the religious foundation in its early years. After all, while William de Burgh had been granted this land by the king, the people already there probably had other ideas. The Augustinian canons in Ireland before the Normans arrived were favoured by de Burgh to fulfil various roles. Prayers for the founder, his family and descendants, and because the Augustinians were one of the less circumscribed religious congregations, the senior religious were expected to play a role in civil administration, especially in de Burgh's territory of Muskerry, which was where Athassel lay. Athassel was in the Diocese of Cashel, but close to the border of Emly Diocese. In the later Middle Ages, the Gaelic Irish became more assertive and the parameters of Dublin Castle control more restricted. Into the 14th century, archbishops of Cashel were Gaelic, a situation not replicated in Emly. Athassel therefore was something of an outlier for crown control in the region. For instance, in July 1290, John de Sandford, who was both Archbishop of Dublin and Chief Governor of Ireland, spent several days in Athassel while on government business in the region. The cost of entertaining his huge entourage in today's money was around €25,000. Unlike religious foundations elsewhere in Europe, Irish houses were not richly endowed with lands, but had to meet their costs, pay their bills, and carry out a range of religious and secular functions. Athassel did have tenants renting property in the settlement, and farms in the surrounding countryside. The priory controlled at least 1,000 acres. Around 1310, for example, when Robert Hauberg died, his son William was his heir and inherited a house and garden in Athassel and around 80 acres nearby, for all of which the interested parties, and there were many, namely the king, the descendant of the founder William de Burgh, the then prior, and the applicant tenant seeking to maintain his family's position, all had to have their respective and sometimes conflicting interests reconciled. Of course, Robert Hauberg's perspective was the here and now, much more focused than the other interests, which were longer term. This tenant's rent was a more temporal source of income for the priory than the so-called spiritualities it controlled. From the early days of men like de Burgh, their control of a region extended to control over the revenue-generating capacity of parishes, and so within his territory he was able to make a grant to Athassel of the tithe revenues of a number of parishes, including some in the neighbourhood: Relic-Murray, Ballygriffin, Uachtraleague, Ballintemple, Rathlinen, Kilfeacle, Clonbalug, Temple Nairi, Solihead, Shronal, Temple No, and Tipperary. Athassel would have appointed priests to carry out the spiritual duties in each of these parishes, but drawn most of the revenues. Making the point that Athassel was not Gaelic was its association with St. Edmund, king and martyr, who was an Anglo-Saxon king, killed in 870 by the Vikings while refusing to abjure his faith. Here you see him being shot full of arrows. Nothing to do with Ireland, but a saint to whom there was great devotion in England, and who now became a patron of Athassel Priory. In this very famous painting, from the end of the 1300s, King Richard II is seen kneeling, and behind him, right to left, are John the Baptist, Edward the Confessor, and King Edmund the Martyr. Much more conventionally, the Blessed Virgin Mary was also a patron of Athassel. Incidentally, while the term is popularly used, Athassel was not an abbey, but a priory, prior having a lower status than an abbot. William de Burgh was just about in time. When he died in 1206, in his mid-40s, the odds are very much against you reaching 70 in the Middle Ages, his foundation at Athassel, just a few years old, was ready enough to receive his body, and indeed Athassel was the burial place for several of his prominent descendants. Ties between Athassel and the de Burghs continued. William's youngest son was prior before becoming Bishop of Limerick in 1224, which was around the time when the king gave permission for an annual fair at Athassel. This is a reminder that a settlement developed around this priory, about which, in the absence of extensive archaeological investigation, little is known. While later in the 13th century the interests of the de Burgh or Burke families ranged across Connaught and Ulster, their foundation at Athassel was never forgotten. In 1946, during archaeological work on the site, a stone panel was found showing 4 standing knights, each in his own space. It had survived because buried under several feet of rubble. Some 30 years later, and other bits were found indicating, more appropriately, a crucifixion scene with Our Lady and St. John. The stone came from a quarry near Bristol, and before ravaged by time and decay was obviously a fitting and costly memorial to someone, and while there is uncertainty with which one, William's grandson Walter, Earl of Ulster, who died in 1271, seems most likely. Today the panel found in 1946 may be seen in the Vicar's Choral on the Rock of Cashel, a safer location. Also, Walter's son Richard, known as the Red Earl, at the end of his life retired to Athassel, where he died and was buried in 1326. An interesting connection was that the daughter of the Red Earl in 1302 married Robert Bruce, who became King of Scotland a few years later. In 1317, when the Scots invaded Ireland, their army was in the vicinity of Athassel. The priory was spared their attention by the fact that the butlers, as ever working on London's behalf, had over 600 men stationed at Athassel. Very much a mixed blessing, as armies lived off the land, and there's a lot of feeding for 600 men. The stability of the 13th century gave way to the fire and fury of the 14th, when control from Dublin weakened, and Athassel was attacked and burned in 1319 by one of the Fitzgeralds, and again a decade later by one of the O'Briens, who, in that immortal phrase, had not gone away. These attacks impacted not just the priory but its attendant settlement. In an entry by a Kilkenny friar, In the first week of August 1329, Brian O'Brien burnt the towns of Athassel and Tipperary and wasted, plundered and destroyed the whole surrounding neighbourhood. In the mid-1300s, into this countryside of petty warlords and sectional interests arrived plague rats and climate change, the Black Death and colder winters. While Athassel survived, it was hardly a furnace of faith, more a damp cockpit of competing material interests. By the 1440s, ironically, or indeed fittingly, it was various members of the Burke family who competed violently for control of Athassel's assets. In 1447, during an attack on the priory, the Archbishop of Cashel arrived with armed men, and one of those with him, a member of the Burke family, was struck by an arrow in the eye while very commendably rescuing one of the Athassel priests. We know about this incident because that member of the Burke family, in later communication with Rome, was concerned lest his disability compromise his own promotion within the church. A few decades later, on the 16th of May, 1480, when David Hackett was prior, Athassel was attacked by a mixed Irish and English gang from Fethard, led by Edward Borden, who not only rustled several hundred cattle and stole around £100 worth of goods and effects, but for good measure kidnapped the prior and held him for the large ransom of £40. By the end of the 1400s, the fabric of Athassel was in decay. For long periods there was no prior, and any sense of a religious community was long gone. Such canons as survived were living privately and not communally, and, whisper it, some had children. A lay administrator was appointed. Finally, when Henry VIII suppressed religious houses like Athassel, no whispering was needed, as part of the charge sheet read that there were but 4 canons, and some of them using and having wives and children. Conveniently, the then Archbishop of Cashel was a butler, half-brother of the Earl of Ormond, and he had charge of Athassel, and politically, of course, Ormond was well placed to benefit from the suppression of a religious foundation like Athassel. In the mid-16th century inventory of Athassel, there is reference to a ruined church, belfry, hall, 4 chambers, a kitchen, barn, cloister, 2 orchards, a garden, watermill, and a rough estimation of 1,000 acres of land divided between pasture, arable, and woodland. In another source from the same period was reference to an old cloister uncovered and in decay. There's something apposite that in March 1548, a gang charged with the murder of Redmond Cantwell, constable at Athassel, was led by a Burke. As was said in a different context, they had not gone away either. Athassel has been described by one eminent expert as perhaps the most exciting of all the Irish monastic sites, and is entered from what is now a back road. The river, of course, was what mattered most, important for defence and for food. What is perhaps most obvious about this religious complex is that it was separated by walls from the surrounding countryside. To get into the priory, a visitor had to go through a gatehouse, and from the obviously disturbed nature of the contiguous ground, now fields where cows may safely graze, there once may have been the beating heart of a settlement. You can imagine the frantic efforts, not necessarily useful, to get into the priory when hostile horsemen appeared on the narrow horizon. Today the gatehouse gives little evidence of its primary defensive purpose, though, as Professor Tygo O'Keeffe remarked, it was not unusual for such gatehouses to have a little chapel. An important, indeed crucial point to remember when looking at what appears a tumble of stones, indeed when looking at any ruin, is that you may be looking at what has fallen down from what was sequentially put up over a long period of time. At its most formidable, there would have been a portcullis, a work of iron lattice that crashed down to reinforce the door. Athassel could be regarded as situated on an island, as early in the foundation's history an artificial channel was cut with water from the river, and not only increasing defence but of economic importance, providing the power of a mill race, and also, it is assumed, allowing for the keeping of eels. A little to the north of the river, towards Golden, there remains evidence of a weir. Other than being part of an armed party, standing on the bridge approaching the gatehouse was an exercise in exposure, as it was intended to be. Today the location of this bridge, with its 4 arches, seeming without purpose, can confuse. Approaching this complex of buildings, it's useful to understand 2 things: that here are the ruins of a church, and the ruins of the buildings associated over a long period of time with the communal life of the Augustinian canons, for whom this was home. The church was described by Tygo O'Keeffe as one of the finest Gothic buildings in Ireland. Crossing the field from the gatehouse, the eye is drawn to the formidable buttresses that seem to guard the entrance, as indeed they did, reinforcing this great west door to the church. To your left was the bell tower, a call not just to prayer, but no doubt a signal for danger. In building this church, indeed in building any structure, where to start? O'Keeffe posits the opinion that building started around 1200, at the business end, meaning where the high altar is, and that separately, maybe a decade later, the imposing west wall, where the main entrance stands, was built. Then, like Fies when the Channel Tunnel was built, would the two ends connect? Work carried out in the 1220s and 30s. The two bills, according to O'Keeffe, in fact, did not quite connect, the west wall being slightly out of kilter with the body of the building. When the church is entered, the first thing to be noticed is the burials in the nave of the church. In its day, there were side aisles and supporting columns. It was always the case that families assumed spiritual value having burial plots in such surroundings. The families responsible for these graves were probably not mindful of the fact that these burials were in the least important part of the church, the part open to the public, and the part separate from where sacred rituals were carried out. The nave is about 120 feet in length, and straight ahead is one of the most distinctive features of a tassel, a pointed arch doorway, which oddly perhaps was internal and divided the more public part of the church from the choir and altar. The original doorway to St. Michael's Roman Catholic Church in nearby Tipperary town, dating from the 1860s, was clearly influenced by this. In a tassel, this fine Gothic doorway is at the apex of the church, where the cruciform shape is manifested. O'Keeffe suggests that this doorway was relocated from the original entrance, when, in a later period, the building with its nave now roofless had to be restructured and spaces repurposed. Behind is the more public part of the church. Ahead, with the chancel, altar and choir, is the more private. The choir, of course, is where the monks gathered, each with his own carved wooden stall, to chant during services. The remains of the crossing tower leads to scholarly speculation that it was rebuilt in the 15th century, when the primary intent may have been defensive. In the beginning, there may not even have been a tower, just a simple convergence of the roofs of the nave, the choir, and the two transepts. In any case, what is left for us to see is a confusion of styles and a puzzlement of intentions, a conundrum that applies especially to the almost completely blocked-in arch at a higher level above the wonderful doorway. It is understood that the blocked-in space above the doorway would have held a large-scale rood or cross with perhaps in the alcoves on either side images of the two patrons, the Virgin Mary and St. Edmund. It suggested that by the time the tower was built, probably by and for someone whose interest in the place was material rather than spiritual, that the body of the church, this fine nave, was already roofless. On each side of this space under the tower was a transept, meaning the two parts of the cross from the perpendicular, and each transept had side chapels. Off the south transept was the sacristy. Here, from one of the two side altars, are stairs, useful at night, connecting the church with the dormitory on the second floor, an extensive building on top of the chapter house, and ground-level storage rooms. The location of the main altar is evident, and the late medieval window that dominates this end wall would on the right day have thrown light down on the main altar. It, however, was smaller than the original 13th century window, which probably had 5 rather than 3 lancets or individually arched windows. However, the twin openings, or niches at a similar level, are original and likely held statues or images. If so, no doubt St. Edmund was in the picture. One of the features to be noted, attached to this end wall of the church, is an incised slab, which would originally have been located elsewhere, that is presumed to show St. Augustine, of obvious interest in an Augustinian Priory, together with his mother St. Monica, as universal identification with St. Augustine's famous prayer, "Lord, give me chastity and temperance, but not yet." Adjacent to the church nave on the other side of the south aisle is the cloister arcade, a rectangular space usually found in such places and used by the canons for exercise and prayer. This would have been covered but not glazed. Here as elsewhere in this complex, there is evidence of fire damage, hardly unexpected in light of the number of attacks that a tassel sustained. In 1882, when the state first paid official attention to a tassel, this cloistered space was a jumble of fallen masonry and tangled ivy and thorns. What might be termed a reconstruction dates from that time. Around this central space are the communal or domestic buildings necessary for the functioning of the institution, including the latrines situated near the northeast corner of the cloister and not far from the refectory. Off the cloister on the east side is the chapter house, which was an official space for administrative meetings relating to the priory, which you will remember was more than this collection of buildings on the bank of the shore, but also had urban and rural tenants. Like elsewhere in the complex, the chapter house underwent changes over time, when the primary impetus for change was always practical and defensive rather than aesthetic and religious. The chapter house is at ground level, while above it was the infirmary, a reminder that in its best days, religious foundations were places of hospitality, refuge and healing. To the south of the cloister on the second floor, over service areas, was the refectory, the southern exterior wall of which remains in quite good order. In 2008, Margaret Quinlan, on behalf of the OPW, drew up a conservation plan for Athassel. As is the way of such plans, not much appears to have happened in the past 15 years, and so what remains of this wonderful complex of buildings continues its losing battle with time, as it quietly moulders to the soporific lapping of the water of the shore. On a back road between Kilfeacle and Golden lies Grantstown Castle, in a townland of the same name. We can assume that the townland got its name from one of the knights to whom William de Burgh gave land in return for military service during the early phase of the Norman conquest, as the 1100s turned into the following century. At that first stage, the newcomers depended on motte and bailey defences, quickly thrown up on suitably raised sites. Places like Kilfeacle or Knockgraffin. Tower houses date from a few hundred years later, from the 15th century, which was the great period of tower house construction, not least in Tipperary and Limerick. This tower house is not actually a castle, which is a complex of buildings like Cahir. Some tower houses have bawns, meaning a surrounding wall that acted as a cattle enclosure. This was a time when the theft of livestock was endemic, an essential part of who we were. After all, cattle raiding plays a key role in the national saga. There's no evidence of a bawn at Grantstown. The designation tower house is exactly right, though that term is entirely modern, being early 20th century. A tower, or more accurately a rectangular keep for defence at a time when central government was weak, and a house, where a minor local landholder lived. The emphasis very much more on defence, not comfort. Donogh MacDonagh got it right when he described the graceless keep, the bleak and slitted eye where fear drove comfort out. Straw on the floor was price of conquering security. When tower houses were built, dominant local families, especially the Burkes and Butlers, had splintered internally into competing interests and, of course, as ever, fought against each other. The Butlers more or less being on the side of the crown, the Burkes rather less so. While a tower house like this looks imposing, it could not withstand artillery, and while the first gun appears to have been fired in Ireland in 1361, the first tower house didn't fall to artillery until 1488 in Westmeath. Tower houses were plentiful. Around Tipperary town there were at least 40, with Grantstown probably the best surviving example. In the county there were several hundred. Right in the centre of Cashel there's an example, and another stands at the end of Liberty Square in Thurles, a town in which there was once 11 tower houses. The equivalent centuries later was the sturdy country house, more comfortable certainly, but with defence not forgotten. Many have stout reinforced window shutters. It is not unexpected that comparable defensive buildings were common along the border between Scotland and England. With respect to the location of this tower house, to the south was Aherlow, a den of rebels and outlaws that stretched for endless seeming forested miles, and to the north the wooden upland of Kilnamanagh. Grantstown was in an exposed position, literally and figuratively. Just before the Great Famine, when John O'Donovan and his colleagues were exploring Irish antiquities, this tower house, long abandoned, was standing 60 feet high and with 6 stories. Neither history nor folklore was collected, and so what was noted was a physical description of the building and a counting of the various windows. There are no less than 13 openings on the east wall. This account intones measurement in place of understanding. In the school's folklore collection from the 1930s, there is a different kind of understanding, an acknowledgement that buildings and places like this that seem to stand against time are of course invested with stories of buried treasure, a wife locked in a cellar, or young Joe Lonergan's wonderful story of canine sacrifice in the face of devilish assault. What we don't have is much historical information about Grantstown. In the disturbed state of Ireland from the late 1500s through to the mid-1600s, with rebellions under the Tudors and Cromwell a reaction to the Stuarts, many fortified places in Ireland felt the weight of cannonballs against their walls, but apparently not Grantstown, which survived intact. The Civil Survey, which is a Cromwellian property inventory looking back from the 1650s, is of two minds about Grantstown. Described as a good castle in repair, though not garrisoned, and it was also characterised as needing repair. At that stage, it was a butler possession. So who built Grantstown? When we looked at Athassel, we saw that what began as a Burke foundation ended as a butler possession, and the story of Grantstown appears to follow the same pattern, though on a very different timeline. Specific documentation about Grantstown is sparse. More than likely it was built by and for a Burke line, one of the Burkes of Muskerry Quirk, which was a line descended from a younger son of the Red Earl. Remember, who was buried at Athassel. Thanks to their loyalty to the Crown, in overall control were the Earls of Ormond, and a document of 1549 indicates that David, son of Theobald Burke of Thomastown, was able to raise the very considerable sum of £200 on Grantstown by mortgaging the property to Ormond. A few decades later, and there is evidence of a transfer of possession of Grantstown from the late Edmund Burke, son of Redmond, son of Godfrey, to Edmund and Redmond Burke, who were great-grandnephews of the said Godfrey. The sum of money paid was £100, or in present value, around €40,000. However, in the 1570s and 80s, Munster and very much this part of Tipperary was in chaos because of episodes of rebellion fronted by the Fitzgeralds of Desmond. The Burkes in Midwest Tipperary were on the losing side and consequently lost possession of their lands. Thomas Butler, Black Tom, the 10th Earl of Ormond, in his will left Grantstown, Kilfeacle and various other lands to his youngest brother Piers Butler, who by name is associated with Grantstown, so we may assume that he lived there. With older brother Thomas, the Earl, keeping in with the Crown, youngest brother Piers was a nuisance and an embarrassment, not only fighting against the traditional enemy the Fitzgeralds, but from around 1569 more than willing to fight against branches of his own family, being unwilling to follow the Crown agenda. Towns like Clonmel and Kilkenny were attacked, as was the property of his brother the Earl. Eventually, recognising that the Fitzgeralds posed a threat not just to the Crown and to his brother the Earl, but to his own interests, Piers Butler changed sides and took part in the defeat of the Fitzgeralds. Brother Piers, who died in the mid-1590s, continued to hold Grantstown from his brother the Earl. After Piers Butler's death, his son, known as Edmund Butler Fitzpiers, continued to hold the property. What happened at Grantstown in the 17th century is confusing. After the restoration of the monarchy in 1660, the Butlers had their control reconfirmed, though taxation records from the 1660s do not indicate that the Tower House, which had multiple hearths, was inhabited. However, during the last flourishing of Butler control, before wrong political choices were made and exile became their lot, one has to admire the tenacity of the Burkes. In 1676, John Burke, gentleman of Grantstown, signed a 21-year lease with the Ormond estate for several hundred acres at Grantstown. There's no evidence that he lived in the Tower House, which buildings were of course by then past their use-by date. Built hundreds of years earlier, when defence and safety were all that mattered, tower houses with their perpendicular living, circular stairs, thick-walled rooms and the lack of light offered nothing in the long 18th century, but many survived as anomalies on the landscape. At ground level is a noticeable batter, which means that the walls at ground level angle towards you, seeming to fix the building even more firmly on the landscape. The arched doorway on the northern side only serves to emphasise the height of the building, at the top of which is the bartizan, which is a defensive overhang from the turret. Unlike today, in the building's original purpose, the ground floor was not domestic. In fact, the higher one went in a tower house, the better the accommodation, not least because the inhabitants could risk better windows. The building on this north side, in fact, has just one window and two wall slits giving minimal light to the spiral staircase. There was a feature of what might be thought of as stacked living. The thrilling feature of this and other tower houses is the so-called murdering hole, a defensive feature allowing those on the first floor direct fire at whoever broke through the front entrance. Noted as part of an official survey in 1943, there was no notion that the building might or could ever be restored. Having been renovated and refurbished in recent years, Grantstown, now as ever, dominates the landscape. One of the neglected aspects of the historic relationship between Britain and Ireland was the necessity for many people to make the sometimes dangerous and often uncomfortable sea journey between Dublin and Holyhead in Anglesey. Making that journey in winter never helped. On Sunday the 15th of December 1619, when returning to Ireland, a ship was wrecked off the Skerries, which is an outcrop of rock north of Holyhead. Among those drowned was Thomas Butler, Viscount Thurles, now forgotten except for 3 points of connection intersecting with him. His father, who outlived him, was the 11th Earl of Ormond. His son was the 12th Earl and became the 1st Duke. And then there was his widow, Elizabeth Poynts, originally from near Bristol. She was an extraordinary woman in her own way, a Roman Catholic when it was politically difficult. She's remembered to history as Lady Thurles, where she spent most of her long life. In 1626, she forewent her widowhood and married George Matthew of Raider in Glamorgan, which is now a suburb of Cardiff. He was a member of a long-established family with its roots in Llandaff, not far from Cardiff city centre, and still the centre of an Anglican diocese. Even though settled in Ireland, an estate in Wales was retained by the family. When a century or so after the Matthew family settled at Thomastown, they managed to get a peerage. They took their title from Llandaff. 11 years married to her first husband, her second husband died in 1636, leaving Lady Thurles a widow again, this time for 37 years, some of which was spent coping with Cromwell from her home at Thurles. With respect to Thomastown, the heart of the story is the crucial relationship between half-brothers, two men who shared the same mother, Lady Thurles. The men were James Butler, born in 1610, and George Matthew. That we are unsure of his date of birth is a comment on the relative importance of the two men. James Butler became the 1st Duke of Ormond and the most powerful man in Ireland, an elevation that brought George Matthew with it, and he became his half-brother's most important man of affairs in Ireland. The Duke was Protestant, while Matthew was Catholic. Such importance required a suitable dwelling, which was built by the early 1670s. This is not the ruins of that house. These are the ruins of an early 19th century remodelling of the original house, which in turn was remodelled some 50 years later. With the restoration of the monarchy in 1660, Ormond became the voice of the king in Ireland and granted thousands of acres, in part what had been lands attached to Athassel Priory, to his half-brother George Matthew. This included Thomastown, which land had been held by Patrick Boyton, a Cashel merchant, one of many Catholic proprietors slated for transportation to Connaught, and in his case, a very inadequate 279 acres in compensation somewhere west of the Shannon. Unlike Athassel, which is quite close, George Matthew chose not to build his house beside the river. By the 1670s, Mr. Matthew was well ensconced in his mansion, from where letters covering personal and business matters went back and forth to Ormond and to Ormond's wife, who was also a butler in her own right. They were often at Kilkenny Castle. In a letter of the 31st of January 1676, written from Thomastown, Ormond was told about the sudden death of Lord Kerr by means of a surfeit of claret. Lord Kerr, another butler, was married to Matthew's niece and notoriously fond of strong wine. In September 1686, Thomastown had its first VIP visitor, no less than the Lord Lieutenant of Ireland and the King's brother-in-law. In the context that it was a house in Ireland, the Lord Lieutenant was impressed, and as he quaintly put it, it is but 15 years since Captain Matthew first sat down where there was not a house upon it. This connection between the Duke of Ormond and his half-brother was the making of the Matthew fortune. Not just at Thomastown, but there was also another Matthew brother, Toby, who had an estate in and around Thurles. An indication of why letters flowed in and out of Thomastown was the debts left by the Duke when he died in 1688. In today's terms, more than €30 million. As George Matthew died the following year, at least he was spared having to cope. Across some 70 years from the building of the house to a faithful year, 1738, 5 generations of Matthews enjoyed Thomastown, the third of whom, another George Matthew, is remembered as Grand George for his conspicuous consumption and the depth of his pockets. He committed to the Church of Ireland in 1711. Famously, Thomas Sheridan, in his biography of Jonathan Swift, described Swift's 4-month-long visit to Thomastown and the extraordinary provision that Grand George made to cater for guests, a description that lost nothing in the telling. How Matthew lived cheaply on the continent for some years so that he could accumulate capital. How Thomastown had 40 commodious apartments for guests with suitable accommodation to their servants. Thomastown was characterised by Sheridan as an hotel and remarkably included both a coffee house and a tavern, 2 centres of conviviality of the period. The description certainly seems exaggerated, but has specific details, such as a waiter in the tavern wearing a blue apron. Sporting interests were catered for, with packs of dogs and 20 hunters ready in the stables for guests who wished to sit on large horses and chase small animals. Tipping of servants was strictly forbidden. Given all of this, it was not surprising that Swift came for a fortnight and stayed for 4 months. Grand George died early in 1738, his son and heir having died 2 years previously, and making 1738 a year of disaster. The last of that Matthew line, Grand George's infant grandson, was, so the story goes, drowned in a lake at Thomastown at the close of that dreadful year. Bad news, but good news for the Thurles branch of the family, who in the person of another George conformed to the Church of Ireland in 1740, and so he enjoyed Thomastown until his death in 1760. At mid-century, a traveller through the county was overwhelmed by Thomastown. Not the house about which nothing was said, but the huge domain encompassed by 9-foot walls, within which were plantations and lawns, together with black cattle, sheep and deer. With no male heir, George Matthew, who had united the Thomastown and Thurles estates, left his property to another branch of the family in the person of Thomas Matthew of Anfield, not far from Thurles. He conformed in 1762 and went to live at Thomastown. Thanks to time and chance, into the hands of Thomas Matthew came the entire Matthew fortune. 2 of the easiest ways to spend large amounts of money during this period was to stand for Parliament and build a bigger house. Members of the family as MPs supported Roman Catholic relief, and in 1783 Thomas Matthew's son Francis climbed the first of 3 steps in the peerage, and in 1797 he was made an earl, taking Llandaff as his title, a recognition of the family's Welsh roots. While remodelling the house didn't take place until around 1812 and was the responsibility of the second earl, from an enthralled visitor to Thomastown in 1780 we have a glimpse of the huge domain, the garden area of which, however, did not please our visitor. To repeat, fashion is reaction, and elements of the garden at Thomastown were too tied to the classical world, meaning beds of flowers in regimented order and a landscape too obviously interfered with by man or a horde of gardeners, rather than a landscape that at least looked entirely as nature decreed. However, it was regarded it all cost money. The first Earl died in 1806, and so his eldest son Francis James became the second Earl. He was 38 when he inherited Thomastown, and with his brothers Montague and George were among the most active regency rakes of their day. This meant that they were profligate with money, and for the second Earl his attention was immediately focused on his home at Thomastown, which, reflecting 18th century classical lines, was out of fashion and in need of a makeover. The reaction to those clean classical lines, what we think of as Georgian, was Gothic revival, and so that an impression is created of medieval antiquity, old towers, turrets and crenellations, jagged stone teeth to impress the visitor in place of the smiling symmetry of the 18th century. The Earl's architect was Richard Morrison, who had lived for a time in Clonmel, and the work was carried out around 1812 at a cost in today's terms of around €5 million. though what was planned on paper was not completely transferred to bricks and mortar, as this illustration by Morrison shows. You will remember the story of Grand George, who accumulated capital before spending lavishly. However, his descendants were far from sensible, spending lavishly, adding to debt, borrowing more, and finding even interest payments becoming unmanageable. Something had to give, and it did. Over a few years, around 1810, thousands of acres were sold, benefiting local landowners like James Scully in Kilfeacle and Justin McCarthy in Kilshan. In today's value, over €15 million was raised, most of which met pressing debts. No wonder the Earl had also to sell his Welsh property. You might have thought that in such circumstances, a lavish building programme was foolish. Sometimes an older house was demolished to make way for the new. In this case, the older building was swallowed by the new, which was meant to look old. Underneath the grey Gothic shell are the rose-red bricks of the original building. The new building was not especially high, the several turrets perhaps giving an impression of height. A feature was the arched windows, especially the large arched windows with 5 lancets on the west gable, a feature that one imagines could be found just as well at a Thassel. The estate village, also designed by Morrison, contributed to the improved look and style of Thomastown. It had 22 houses, a medical dispensary and a school, and the inhabitants worked in the castle or the grounds. Estate villages like this were always seen as reflecting the estate and, of course, its owner. Through the 19th century and after, as management of the castle collapsed and control over the estate dissipated, this was reflected in the estate village as seen in this 1914 photograph. In 1827, an officer's wife on her way to Cashel with her husband noted that Thomastown was a beautiful village. The cottages all thatched and whitewashed, with green doors and window shutters, and standing in small gardens, are very superior to what are generally seen in Ireland. The castle, a fine pile of Gothic building, stands about half a mile from the road and is approached through an avenue of noble trees. One hopes that the Earl enjoyed his castle. We have an intriguing glimpse of him from October 1828, when a German visitor to Cashel, gloriously named Hermann Ludwig Heinrich von Puckler-Muskau, got the loan of a horse and first of all visited a Thassel, which he found disappointing because of its setting in a bog surrounded by ploughed fields without a tree or shrub. This German had fixed views about gardens, and Thomastown was also a disappointment. There was nothing special about the domain, over 2,000 acres of it. The trees are not fine. There were no interesting water features, and he dismissed the modern Gothic house as, and I quote, hideous. As this map from the early 1840s makes clear, there were plenty of trees and of water. The most interesting comment was that the house was painted light blue. This visitor was positive, however, about the Earl, whom he met, dressed as a plain farmer in marsh boots and waterproof cloak, standing in the rain, directing his labourers. This German visitor approved of an Irish landowner being so engaged with his property. He did, however, describe Llandaff as 70. He was in fact 60, which for the period meant an old man. Today, as a legacy of this estate management, there are 3 townlands between 2 civil parishes, named Thomastown Domain, a total of 1,484 statute acres. Part of Ballymacady and 2 smaller townlands, Ross and Rathduff, were also part of the original domain. The road turning south from the crossroads, the L3406, was an estate road, its function at the service of the domain. An indication of this is the fact that Thomastown Crossroads is not actually a crossroads. As you come from Tipperary and turn right, that corner was the main entrance to the estate, and something of its grandeur with the gatehouse, glimpsed through the railings, may be seen from this 1914 photograph. There was also a more direct entrance to the castle from the main road. Along this passage, as the visitor approached the castle, you passed under a gate tower, very much a declaration of taste and wealth, and, of course, in the Gothic style. From the first edition Ordnance Survey, we get some understanding of the attention lavished on the grounds around the castle. The 3 primary features of this planned landscape were the mixture of dense and scattered woodland, the very formal garden area to the east of the castle, and the artificially created lake complex to the north. A design element was the connecting channel between the 2 lakes. You may call to mind the sad story that the infant grandson of Grand George drowned in this lake in 1738. With regard to the castle itself, Some antiquarian prints, for example this one, are misleading in that a substantial wing, complete with turrets, is shown. On the plans perhaps, but never built. A visitor arriving from the main road entrance could enter the main stable complex, a courtyard surrounded by a range of ancillary buildings with, of course, stabling for plenty of horses. A serious fire in 1876 appears to have started here. The main entrance to the castle itself was surprisingly low-key, what today might be thought of as Disney-esque turrets, complete with crusader crosses, arched Gothic windows and fairy-like battlement portico. The second Earl died in 1833, 5 years after this encounter in his garden with his German visitor. With no children and his brothers already dead, his property passed to his unmarried sister Elizabeth, who ruled the roost until her death in December 1841. This portrait of her as a child by Sir Joshua Reynolds reveals nothing of the formidable woman she became. As was not at all unusual, with the thousands of acres that she inherited went a mountain of debt, to which end in 1837 there was a failed effort to sell the estate. Her story is very much linked with that of Theobald Matthew, who was ordained as a Capuchin in 1813. His father James, from a collateral and Roman Catholic branch of the family, was employed to help manage the estate. Unlike, for example, the Maudes in Dundrum, the Matthews had no anti-Roman Catholic bias. On St. Stephen's Day, 1840, Lady Elizabeth threw open the doors of Thomastown and entertained some 300 members of local temperance societies to dinner and dancing. One has to wonder how many of the guests snuck away for a quick drop. There was speculation, but never any question of Father Matthew inheriting the estate. For one thing, his religious status precluded such material gain. Lady Matthew died on the 14th of December 1841. By no means the last of the Matthew family, and as shall be noted, not the last of the family to own Thomastown. Like a cheap storyline, hardly was Lady Elizabeth dead when a man calling himself Edward Matthew turned up in Thurles making claims. And there were others especially interested in claiming the Landgraf title. It should be said that in her younger days, Lady Elizabeth was imbued with the spirit of Regency Britain and had a son without the formality of marriage. There was talk that the father may have been the Prince Regent himself. In disposing of her property, Lady Elizabeth Matthew looked to her mother's sisters and their families. In 1764, the first Earl married Ellis Smith, a woman from County Wicklow, who, apart from her obvious beauty, brought with her a dowry worth, in today's values, at least €2.5 million. At this point, it may be useful to summarise the convoluted inheritance history of Thomastown. Welshman George Matthew married the widow of Viscount Thurles. Eldest son, Theobald, settled at Thurles. Established a younger son, Thomas, at Anfield, from whom Father Theobald descended. The younger son, George, established at Thomastown. His grandson was Grand George, whose death in 1738 was the end of that line. Thomastown passed George, another one, a great-grandson of the Theobald who settled at Thurles. When George died without a male heir in 1760, Thomastown passed to Thomas of Anfield, in whom all of the Matthew property, including the Welsh estate, came together. In keeping with this improved status, his son Francis became the first Earl of Landgraf. His son was Francis James, the second Earl, who died in 1833, leaving everything to his sister, Lady Elizabeth Matthew, who died unmarried in 1841. With the death of Lady Elizabeth Matthew, the estates in both Thomastown and Thurles passed to Louis William de Rohan Chabot, then 61 years of age and a Major General in the French army. He was Lady Elizabeth's first cousin. Their mothers were sisters and had long established Irish connections. In 1809 he married a daughter of the second Duke of Leinster. Chabot was not a supporter of Napoleon, on whose defeat he and his family were able to resume their position at the French court. Debt on the estate was a constant. By 1858, the Thurles 3,904 acres estate and the Thomastown 4,191 acres estate returned a rent of just over £8,000 per annum. That's worth about €1.3 million. However, against this was debt of at least €18 million. As long as interest payments could be met, the bailiffs could be kept outside the gates. In 1859, over 2,000 acres of the Thomastown estate were sold, together with some 1,700 acres of the Thurles estate. The £41,000 realised helped to keep creditors appeased. One of the townlands sold was Ardebreen, which included the estate village. 104 acres was sold for £2,000. Another purchaser of land was Francis Lowe of Kilshan. After the Revolution of 1848, when the Bonaparte family resumed power in France, the family of the Vicomte Chabot was out of favour and remained in exile. Fortunately, they had their Irish home at Thomastown. Chabot lived into his 90s, in his later decades disappearing from view, sequestered at Thomastown. His place was taken by his son, Philippe Ferdinand Auguste de Rohan Chabot, Count de Jarnac. His mother was a Fitzgerald, daughter of the Duke of Leinster and de Jarnac, born in 1815 at Carton House in Kildare. In 1840, when he was only 25, he was sent by his government to supervise the repatriation of Napoleon's remains from the island of St. Helena to France and to its final resting place in Paris. De Jarnac had artistic talents, and this is his painting of the remains lying in state on the ship returning to France. Ironically, de Jarnac's family opposed the Bonapartes politically, and during the years when Napoleon III ruled France, that's the 1850s and 60s, de Jarnac lived in exile in Thomastown and was very much part of Tipperary life, for example being very involved with the local agricultural show. In 1859, Thomastown was visited by the grandson of Louis Philippe, the French king overthrown in 1848. De Jarnac published plays and novels and promoted theatrical performances at Thomastown for family and friends. This is the title page of one of his novels. By the 1870s, everything changed for him. The government of Napoleon fell, and the Republican government offered de Jarnac the post of French ambassador to the United Kingdom. Sadly, de Jarnac had hardly taken up his post when he died suddenly at the embassy in London in March 1875. A few months later, his 95-year-old father died, once again changing the ownership of Thomastown. In Lady Elizabeth Matthew's will, there was provision that the estate would pass sequentially to Chabot, her own natural son, and then to the Daly family. Her son having died without heirs in 1845, by the 1870s that left the Daly family, whose seat was Dunsandle in Galway. While Chabot was a connection through Lady Elizabeth's maternal aunt, the Daly connection was through a maternal uncle. The Daly who actually inherited Thomastown was Dennis, 2nd Baron Dunsandle. The castle was surplus to requirements, and the land, what was left of it, was burdened with debt, so he may not have been that thrilled with his Tipperary inheritance. Shortly after inheriting the property, there was a major fire in June 1876. Fortunately, de Jarnac's brother-in-law was present. The fire aptly appears to have originated in a smoking room on the north side of the stable yard, which area of the castle was badly damaged. As previously, it may be useful to summarise this complicated succession. Ignoring any Matthew relatives, Lady Elizabeth opted for her mother's family. She was Ella Smith, daughter of a Wicklow MP and granddaughter of a Bishop of Down and Connor. Her sister Elizabeth married Charles de Rohan Chabot, whose son was the Vicomte de Chabot and grandson the Count de Jarnac. Both father and son died in 1875. Her brother Skeffington married Margaret Daly. Their daughter married James Daly, 1st Baron Dunsandle. Their grandsons are William and Dennis Daly, last owners of the Thomastown estate. Lord Daly's son William, who died in 1910, appears to have occasionally lived at Thomastown. The estate in this last period was managed by Thomas Butler of Ballycarn, and in what was one of the last great social occasions in Thomastown, in August 1892 hosted a ball with a local attendance, mainly tenants. Catering was provided by a Cashel hotel. 8 years later, a local entrepreneur stole lead from the castle roof, not helpful with respect to the future of the castle, which through the 20th century and into the next was allowed its ivy-clad slumber, disturbed from time to time when the outside world took notice, as for example it did on Sunday the 25th of June 1939. On that day, a huge crowd gathered at Thomastown to witness the unveiling of a statue of Father Theobald Matthew, marking the centenary of his great mission to convince Irishmen that a great deal less alcohol should be consumed. The guest of honour was Bishop David Matthew, auxiliary to the Archbishop of Westminster, and a great-grandson of Father Theobald's youngest brother. With Bishop Matthew was his younger brother, Gervase, a Dominican priest. The Taoiseach, Eamon de Valera, was also present. The Matthew brothers and other guests may be seen in this amateur footage taken by Jim McAvoy. The whole occasion, with receptions in Tipperary town, where a street was named in Father Theobald's honour, and an event at Rockwell was seen as important. That was in 1939. With the war over, in the summer of 1946, David Matthew, now an archbishop, paid a return visit, during which he purchased the site of the castle using the trusteeship of Motte na Tíre. And so the ruins continued to quietly decay, their survival of course aided by the fact that there is no right-of-way to the site. These have been scenes from a Tipperary landscape. Today, just grassy mounds or tumbled stones, but in their times, places of burial, of sanctuary, of defence and of display, but all part of our shared history, part of the story of this part of Ireland, of this part of Tipperary. To again quote T.S. Eliot, "We shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started, and know the place for the first time."